I'm Billy S, welcome back to the channel. Today we're adding a bit extra to our order as I rank the Soulsborne DLCs from worst to best. Of the 7 Soulsborne games, we have had 4 different games receive DLC, and a 5th is on its way with Shadow of the Erdtree. Dark Souls 1 had Artorias of the Abyss, Dark Souls 2 had the Crown of the Sunken King, Crown of the Old Iron King, and Crown of the Ivory King. Bloodborne had the Old Hunters, and Dark Souls 3 had Ashes of Ariandel and the Ringed City. Technically, Sekiro Shadows Die Twice had free DLC in the form of the Gauntlets of Strength, which came with 3 new bosses, but it is a very different type of DLC to the rest of the list, and I feel it's kind of unfair to compare. But when I eventually go and rank all of the DLC bosses from worst to best, I will try to include the inner fights from Sekiro. Now then, let's not waste any time. All 7 Soulsborne DLCs ranked. Let me know your favourites in the comments below. I suspect that as this list rises, I'll have a few opinions that don't match the general populace. But I think most people will agree with me when I say the weakest of the DLCs is the Crown of the Sunken King from Dark Souls 2. Keep in mind, when I say weakest of the DLCs, that really doesn't mean bad. FromSoftware tends to make their best content in their DLCs, and of the lot, I just replay the Sunken King the least. The main area you explore is Shulva the Sanctum City, as you wrap around through dilapidated ruins to the Inner Sanctum, and I really like this outdoor area. Switches you can trigger with arrows to move buildings, creating platforming puzzles to reach specific items, and even a bonfire. Genuinely tough enemies that require a bit of strategy and positioning to take down effectively, all the while the memory of Sin the Dragon haunts you from your first time entering the DLC. But where it loses me is the Inner Sanctum, with all the traps and tribulations that come with it. I've always wanted a funhouse level that hits the same beats as Sen's Fortress, and the Inner Sanctum is moving in that direction, but suffers from rather poor enemy design with the Ghost Shulva Knights. This room of all the spikes is unbearable for me on any playthrough, as there are tons of the ghosts running around, and their room with the coffins is up this ladder, across some narrow pathways. There's just no strategy for me here, only panic-induced running and praying that I can break the statues before they kill me. Leaving the Sanctum and wrapping back to the elevator near your first bonfire also feels a bit fillery. It's like making the level wrap in on itself for the sake of it, and not because it feels designed that way in the world. Still, where this DLC shines are its 2 major boss fights. Alana the Squalid Queen is if Nishandra's fight was done well, and while her summoning adds an element of RNG that is hard to compete with, especially if you get multiple Velstadt summons, I don't dislike it. And Sin is the redeeming factor of Dark Souls 2's dragon fights, giving a varied moveset and making a poison dragon somehow fun to fight. Just make sure to bring repair powder or your weapon might break. The DLC then takes a nosedive with the optional Cave of the Dead co-op area that is filled with awful status-afflicting enemies, and the Shulva Gank Squad boss at the end. Not very fun, but it's been roasted to death enough, I think we can move on. It is worth noting that obviously each DLC will come with its own new armor sets, boss weapons, new spells, etc. But for Dark Souls 2 specifically, I never really cared about any of that, as by the time I got to the DLCs, I was fairly comfortable with the build I'd already crafted. So unless I specifically go out of my way to talk about gear in a DLC, it's not going to factor into my rankings. I'm just not a player who optimizes builds. Solid 7 out of 10 DLC though. Next up on our list, perhaps controversially, we have the Crown of the Ivory King from Dark Souls 2. Ilium Lois is one of the best areas in the game, and having a DLC that revolves around exploring an area twice over with differences depending on whether it's frozen or melted is, at least for me, pretty genius. The fact that you can access the final boss of the DLC at pretty much any time, making it a case of when you feel comfortable taking on the Burnt Ivory King, is so cool. It lets you pick your own difficulty. But saving the Lois Knights is perhaps one of the best ways to get players exploring the environment. It's rare that FromSoft gives the players concrete objectives in their games, but here we have a very blatant mission, and it makes Ilium Lois and the story aspect of this DLC with Ulsana very memorable. However, I can say that about all of FromSoftware's DLCs, and I think Crown of the Ivory King suffers when I look at the overall package. Because while the main portion of the DLC with the Burnt Ivory King is one of the peak moments of the series, with such a grandiose arena entrance and fight, we also have the elephant in the room, or I should say, the two King's beasts in the room, as while King's pet Ava is a fantastic little fight where you can face her while invisible or visible, depending on your progress in the DLC, I can't say the same about Lud and Zalen. If the Frigid Outskirts did not exist in this DLC, I genuinely would have it in my top 4, straight up. But as I have to take everything into account, the co-op hell that they unleashed upon the world affects my rankings, and no amount of slain electric reindeer is going to help combat this. I despise the Frigid Outskirts. I hate Lud and Zalen. It's a real shame that these optional bosses were taken from this DLC and repackaged. Lazy, lazy, lazy. I also didn't enjoy the reuse of previous bosses from the base game, such as the Flexile Sentries in the cave containing the key to the Frigid Outskirts, and the Covetous Demon in the ice cave past the lower city. I would have liked to see more enemies inspired by the location, and not Sonic the Ice Hedgehog rolling around at the speed of sound, decimating my health bar. Despite my grievances, we have so many cool concepts for Ilium Lois though, player phantoms that betray you, an invader who turns into like a barrel or something, the soul statues that are in danger of activating once the city thaws out. Just general exploration is so solid in the main level, I can't praise it enough. But I also can't praise it more than my future entries. If I can just take a moment of your time, I'm trying to reach 10,000 subscribers by the end of 2023, and now I'm back from summer break, I know we can do it. Look at how many of you aren't subscribed. So be sure to parry that subscribe button for more gaming countdowns every Wednesday and Saturday. Back to the video. When I first scripted this list, I had Dark Souls 3's Ashes of Ariandel in my top 3, because I think this is an incredibly solid piece of DLC in a very similar vein to the Dark Souls 2 packs, as it revolves around a singular large area and the exploration within. Ariandel is a cold, frigid snowfield, and nowhere in the main game gives these vibes. Yes, Irithyll is cold and has a similar color palette, but you're not trudging through forests of cursed trees, dodging millwood knights and soldiers left and right like you found your way to Helheim. I'm personally a fan of when you reach the chapel and you're led down to the Corvian settlement and the mountain pass beyond, as the level design feels a lot tighter here, though I do recognize that some may prefer the open-ended level design of the Ariandel snowfield. The enemy concepts here are top-notch, from the followers to the gigantic millwood knights, the tree spirits and their candlelit branches, but easily for me, the Corvian Knights take the cake for best enemy design. The Wolverine-like claws of the one that drops from the bridge when you first enter, and then the rapier-wielding one that slays the Corvians making their way up the hill to the gate. Come on now, so cool. I like the brief encounter with Sir Wilhelm and his silky smooth ASMR lover voice, and once we hit the mountain pass, the level design takes a turn for the fantastic. Shortcuts that wrap back around to the bonfire as you progress, but the mountains are also so maze-like and enemies pour from every crack and crag. It's intense and difficult, and a perfect way to amp up the difficulty. Maybe nerf the Earthquake Millwood Knight attacks a little bit. I also might be one of the few people who likes the journey down the chasm to the Grave Tender boss fight. While said boss is an absolute waste of space and time, only existing to give you access to the PvP arenas added in this DLC update, making my way down the routes to the frozen lake below just appeals to me. I'm the guy who likes the platforming in Blighttown after all. The nest area can be pretty forgettable. I like that it implies there's rot building up from under the chapel because of Sister Fried, but I hate the enemies. Still, you're only here for a few moments, and once you get out, you get to face one of the best boss fights FromSoftware has ever created, Sister Fried and Father Ariandel, a 3-stage boss fight that absolutely delivers on all the right notes and pretty much justifies the price of this DLC. I still find it funny that they give you a Titanite slab after beating Phase 2 just to trick you into thinking you've won, and I love that when you beat her, the story doesn't end. The artist moves into the chapel and it all ties into the second DLC like a nice continuous story. If there was a better optional boss and just a little bit more content, especially when you compare this DLC pack to its successor, maybe it would have been higher. That's my final verdict. Just missing out on my top 3, the final DLC pack from Dark Souls 2 on today's list, it's the Crown of the Old Iron King. Taking place in Broom Tower, this fiery forge that you have to work your way down, using smelter wedges to destroy the fragments of Nadalia, is perhaps one of my favourite fire levels in Soulsborne. If Shulva and Eliam Lois were more focused on delivering cities to explore, Broom Tower is this vertical maze filled with countless rooms to explore, obstacles to avoid, and a whole host of inspired fiery enemies to defeat. My favourites are the giant knights that bleed molten lava out of their sockets. The basic enemies here are also really cool looking. I like that they can come up from the ash. They can gang up on you very quickly, which isn't as fun, but if you arrive with a fully upgraded weapon, you should be good to go. The mage enemies add a nice wrinkle as you keep progressing down, and while not every room is perfect, this one with the Idol of Nadalia is absolute hell, I still think the overall quality is stellar. By the time you reach the floating armor sets on the lower levels that look like possessed ghosts, you're in deep. I like that this DLC requires you to explore every inch of the environment to complete your main goal, which I believe is destroying Nadalia, while traversing to the side towers to collect an item needed to reactivate the forge. Now, there is a case to be made for this area being brutal when it comes to the smelter wedges, as it's possible to run out of them before your boss battle with the Fume Knight at the bottom of the tower, leading to him being able to heal himself. I recognize this flaw, but when everything else in the DLC is so good, I just can't bring myself to knock it. Of the areas, the Iron Passage, as well as the memory runback leading up to the Suralon boss fight, are awful, and once again bring down the stock of this DLC, especially when they both lead to 2 great fights. I'm one of the people who loves the Blue Smelter Demon, as they completely changed up its speed and tells, and Suralon is the fan favorite fight from Dark Souls 2. Shame they got done so dirty with the runbacks. Fume Knight is a perfect main boss for this DLC in that cold, ashen arena, and I love the way he's able to interact with the player if you enter wearing Velstat's helmet, setting him into Phase 2 immediately. The lore of the Old Iron King, Broom Tower, Suralon, Velstat, and the Fume Knight is one of my favorites in the series, and definitely surpasses that of the other DLCs so far. Plus, this DLC introduced the Fume Knight Ultra Greatsword, one of the most iconic strength weapons in Dark Souls. Why doesn't it make my top 3 then, though? Well, as I said, Iron Passage sucks, Suralon's boss runback sucks, and honestly, I just feel these last 3 DLCs go above and beyond in a way that Dark Souls 2 just never could quite achieve. Taking the bronze medal, we have the Ringed City DLC from Dark Souls 3. This may come as a big surprise to longtime viewers who know I don't actually have the fondest memories of either the Dreadheap or the Ringed City areas. The Dreadheap is a spectacle visually, but the appearance of the angels, some of the earlier enemies such as the humanity dregs that can swarm you in that one building, it kinda turns me off a little bit. And last week, I actually discussed my thoughts on the Earthen Peak Ruins swamp area in great detail, so I'll link you guys to that video if you want my full thoughts. But the TLDR is Poison Swamp plus Angel Attack spam equals miserable time. Meanwhile, the Ringed City is a tale of two halves. I think the city streets that you explore in the first half of the level, as well as the last third, are extremely enjoyable. I tend to ignore the giant swamp of nothingness, there's not really much going on there, and many of the enemies are fun to fight in a vacuum. But I find myself getting overwhelmed constantly despite trying my absolute best to manage the threats of the Ringed City Knights, those irritating clerics that can turtle your attacks, and that main street with the spam of those large humanity knights. I haven't even mentioned the curse-afflicting enemies. Yet, with all of my complaints leveled at the PvE content, this DLC is completely saved 100% by its absolutely stellar boss lineup. Yes, even Half-Light, who has a pretty unique moveset for an invader-type enemy. The Demon Princes are an absolute spectacle, one of the hardest fights in the game, set to that ruined arena of Firelink Shrine from Dark Souls 1. Midir is an absolute beast of a dragon that was misunderstood heavily at launch, but now with the knowledge that his head is his weak spot, it creates a fantastic feeling fight that is a treat to complete. And Gale, I mean, what can I say about Gale that people haven't already said? It really was the perfect fight to end the Dark Souls trilogy in one of the coolest arenas in the series. The last two creatures left alive, an unkindled one, and a slave knight. I also have to give shout out to the DLC for giving us the Dragon Slayer armor set, as you can fight him in the Poison Swamp of Nothingness in the Ringed City. And also, shout out to the Lap questline. The way they reinvent and show a new side to a character we've all come to know over the years is fantastic, and well worth solving that one humanity puzzle to access. Yeah, I may not be as high on the Ringed City myself, but if I'm talking objectively, it is a top 3 Soulsborne DLC, and well worth the effort if only for the boss fights, which are some of the best in the franchise. Onwards and upwards. It really is like FromSoftware to absolutely nail the concept of a DLC campaign on their very first go. Our silver medalist is the Artorias of the Abyss DLC from Dark Souls 1, and my god, this DLC felt targeted towards me on so many levels. From the way you return to the past and get to explore an entirely different rendition of my favorite Dark Souls 1 area, Darkroot Garden, in the form of the Royal Wood, taking on adorable scarecrow enemies and the stone soldiers in their prime, there's just enough side paths and hidden items to make the area feel fun to explore while not being so large that you never find your way forwards. And seeing the abyss rising up from the cracks in the ground, Calamite slamming onto a nearby bridge to let you know there's more going on than just Manus and his bullshit, leading to that Colosseum and the Ulasil Township. Oh my god, I adore the Ulasil Township, and the idea of exploring an environment that is slowly sinking into the abyss, the different side paths and extra rooms to explore make the area feel expansive even when it really isn't. I'm not a fan of the bloated dark mages though, as some of them are placed in rather unfair locations, and the regular enemies can be overwhelming if you're not strong enough to handle them, but then seeing their red eyes in the gloom as you descend into darker places is... whew, it hits, man. I still think this little segment after you unlock the elevator shortcut with the multiple dark mages though is a bit unfair. It's followed though by a battle with a chained up prisoner that has been experimented upon, and I thought this was going to be a boss. It stuck with me. But no, we descend into the chasm of the abyss, discover humanity sprites, save Sif from their fate, and ultimately find ourselves facing down Manus. You can find the most powerful spell in Dark Souls 1, the Darkbead sorcery, near the start of this area, and let me tell you, it makes replaying the game for 100% as a sorcerer very easy indeed. And I haven't even touched on the bosses. There's not a bad one in the bunch. The Sanctuary Guardian could be seen as a throwaway fight, or a welcome to the DLC fight, but it still has a strong moveset, great design, and is one of the few enemies that uses electricity in a meaningful manner. Kalameet is one of the hardest bosses in the game and the first truly special dragon fight that Soulsborne was able to offer us, even gifting players the Calamity Ring for their New Game Plus challenge runs as a reward. Manus is a perfect end boss, being this aggressive creature that somehow also seems like a prototype for what Miyazaki had planned for both Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3. Manus was built to challenge the very conventions that Dark Souls 1 was built upon, and yet is still a completely learnable fight. I love his wombo combo that traps you for an age. I love his dark magic and how you don't need the pendant from the township to win, but it is worth having all the same. More than anything else though, fucking Artorias. My favorite character in Soulsborne easily, the most tragic of heroes with, at the time, one of the most intense 1v1 fights in the series. He may seem easy now, but at the time, I still found his moveset and battle style engaging, and even after all those years, I still find it engaging. The music, the backstory, saving his wolf, and having Sif have a different boss cutscene if you save his fight for later in the game, ugh! And you get to use the Abyss Greatsword, his weapon, if you transpose his soul. Or you can trade it with Kiaran? I don't know how to say her name, to get her tracers without needing to kill her. Any excuse to cosplay Artorias is a good excuse for me. It was my favorite DLC, and it was also my first Soulsborne DLC I ever played. But then a few years later, Miyazaki topped it completely. The best DLC in the Soulsborne franchise is, without a doubt, the Old Hunters DLC, and there's no comparison. The sheer amount of content given to players revitalized Bloodborne and gave us exactly what we wanted. A DLC based around the lore of the Healing Church, allowing us to meet some of the most major players in the story, while also recontextualizing characters we already knew and loved with a dash of eldritch horror. The Hunter's Nightmare was this garish mishmash of Cathedral Ward and Central Yharnam, where the beasts were frail and the hunters drunk on their power, like prison wardens taunting the prisoners. Immediately getting to fight the old hunters as regular enemies was like opening a good present on Christmas Day. The common consensus, after all, was that the best fights in the game were Hunter v Hunters, so having an entire DLC based around that content? Yes! Yet there were subtle hints towards the secrets hiding within. Cthulhu-looking church knights, a snail that fell from the sky, Simon and his curiosity when you speak to him. There was a sense of needing to delve deeper. I could gush for longer about the Hunter's Nightmare area, but let it be known that aside from the Bloodlickers, I think all the enemies are extremely fun and appropriate, and the way they played on your expectations, such as entering the Central Yharnam house where you'd normally find a man with a gun in a wheelchair, only to be lured into an explosive trap, they've got a sense of humor over there. The research hall, while not fully my cup of tea due to the aggressive nature of the enemies, is a labyrinthian vertical maze of stairways and side rooms that is perfectly designed. Shortcuts allow you to keep some of your progress, and once you activate the mechanism to move the stairways, you gain access to a whole host of even more rooms to explore. Then, after the Astral Clock Tower, you emerge into the most striking nightmare area of them all, the Fishing Hamlet. And like a normal hamlet, it's not a particularly large locale, but it's dense and compact, and every enemy is unique and different. The fishmen, the sharks, the electric mages, the invasions by Brador, even a few winter lanterns. And throughout this DLC, all of these areas, Miyazaki added 16 new weapons to find and play with. 11 trick weapons and 5 firearms. Anybody who knows about Bloodborne's weapon system knows how insane that is, because trick weapons have 2 completely different forms. It's like using 2 movesets. It's like instead of making 11 weapons, he made 22. And they had fan favorites like the Whirligig Saw, the Rakuyo, the Church Pick, the Boom Hammer, as well as the weirder ones like the Amygdalan Arm or the Cos Parasite. And at the top of the pecking order, the Holy Moonlight Sword, FromSoftware's signature weapon, which brings me perfectly into the bosses. We got 5 different boss fights for this DLC, 4 obligatory, 1 optional, all of them fantastic. The Living Failures is the weakest of the bunch, but you know what? I respect that they tried to redeem themselves from the Celestial Emissary boss of the main game, and their lore is pretty horrifying. Then you have 2 major lore figures that we had been eagerly wanting to meet, Lawrence the First Vicar and Ludwig the Accursed. While Lawrence is a divisive fight, I quite enjoy his battle and wouldn't mind going toe-to-toe with him any day. I do prefer his phase 2 though, especially with that OST. And the same can be said for Ludwig, an absolutely stunning OST accompanying one of the most frantic and brutal fights in the Soulsborne franchise, especially if you don't know his moveset. All of this building up to the reveal of the Moonlight Greatsword on his back, leading into the second phase where he becomes an entirely new character, his humanity restored, fighting you with all of his might. It's a fan favorite battle and one of my favorite cutscenes in Soulsborne. It's in my top 5, but for me, nothing compares to the last 2 bosses. Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower, who has one of the most memed opening cutscenes due to the way the camera pans at your character as she grabs you, followed by one of the most badass hunter fights in the game. She originated the flaming sword attacks that would soon become a standard for future Soulsborne bosses, using that accursed Canehurst blood art to slay you before you can discover her secret. And knowing she once worked with German and our doll is based on her likeness, oh, it hit hard. All this to end with what some consider to be one of the toughest bosses in Soulsborne, the Orphan of Kos. Not what anybody expected from the final boss of the DLC, but he's easily one of the most fun fights I've had in any game, ever. From the way he screams and roars, throws his placenta. Look, just watch my Bloodborne boss ranking videos, I go into so much detail there and I am very proud of them, so links in the top right corner. There is just so much amazing content, so many amazing fights tied to some amazing areas, and the new weapons completely revitalized Bloodborne's PvP scene in a way that was fascinating to watch. No other DLC has come close to the level of polish of the old Hunters, so let's see what Shadow of the Erdtree can bring, eh? Thank you all for watching another Soulsborne video. Which DLC pack is your favorite? Let me know down below, and be sure to parry that subscribe button to stay up to date on all of my latest videos every Wednesday and Saturday. My social media links are on screen now, feel free to follow where you feel comfortable. I recommend either my Twitter or my Blue Sky if you have it. A massive shout out to the 6 patrons on my Patreon, you guys are awesome, thank you for supporting me for another month. JuJuJewel especially, you're the newest one. And I will see you guys on Saturday for one of my Zelda videos. Adios!